Hi, welcome back to my channel, Beautiful Minutia. If you're new here, my name is Tiffany, and today I'm going to talk to you about the books that I read in November. November was a slower reading month for me, and I've been saying that increasingly as the months in this fall go on. But I think what's normal for me is to complete in the 10 to 13 book range, and that usually includes a manga volume or two, some novellas, all of that kind of stuff. But in the month of November, I completed 5 books. I had a couple of DNFs, but even within the books that I finished, I had like 2 longer books and then 3 shorter books. So I was kind of just like all over the place. I just didn't have quite as much time or mental bandwidth to read as I might have preferred. In fact, November is nonfiction November, and I only read one nonfiction, but it was a long one. So I'm going to have this divided up into genres so that way you can skip around if you would like to. I have some classics, one nonfiction, and one sci-fi slash fantasy, maybe. Let's start with the nonfiction for nonfiction November. I read Wild Swans. So this is a book about a generational story, really, of 3 women in China. So we begin with the grandmother, who was a concubine to someone, and then we continue on to her daughter, who served during the Cultural Revolution underneath Mao. And then we have the daughter, who also was kind of part of all the communist stuff coming about. And so it's really interesting because throughout these 3 generations, you're seeing the transformation of China and how it impacts the people. And so it was really interesting. I feel like I learned a lot. It is super well written with lots of historical detail to tell you of like what is going on in the country and how that is impacting not just this family we're following, but people who aren't even part of the family, because their family, because they kind of had an in with some of the political things that were happening, there were things that didn't affect them the way that it was affecting, some of the more impoverished or outcast people at the time of the Cultural Revolution. And so there's a lot of historical context of what was happening to the author specifically as a young child and how her experience was different from other people, as well as kind of, just the brainwashing that happened with Mao in China during the Cultural Revolution. And I was so fascinated to read this because I really love memoirs of like North Korean defectors. And it was really interesting to get an insight of someone who was in China during this time period, because a lot of the things that Mao did and a lot of the ways that he manipulated and controlled people is very similar to the Kims in North Korea and what they have done. And so it was really eerie seeing like some of the parallels and stuff. So this was fabulous. I had heard nothing but fantastic things about it before I went into reading it, and it lived up to all of my expectations. It is a longer one, so it did take me pretty much the entirety of the month to finish. I really wanted to read it physically, but ended up pretty much entirely listening to it on audiobook, and the audiobook narrator is absolutely fabulous, so that is not a bad way to go about reading this book if you are more of an audiobook person. My other kind of one-off book, in that there's only one book in this category, is And Put Away Childish Things by Adrian Tchaikovsky. I picked this up kind of on a whim. I had heard Murphy Napier talking about it on her channel. I had heard lots of people talk about Adrian Tchaikovsky, and I'd yet to read any of his books. He is more of a sci-fi author than a fantasy author, but I would say that this book very much toes the line. So this is a novella about a man who is essentially like trying to make it into the acting world, but he's only been able to do gigs on children's shows, but he wants to become a more serious actor. His grandmother wrote a series of famous children's stories that are very similar to the Narnia stories. And so that's kind of where we're going with. I mean, you can tell kind of from the cover, it looks like a wardrobe. It looks very snowy. So it's very meta in what it's doing and how it's talking about portal fantasies. And he essentially ends up going into this world that his grandmother, he thought, wrote stories about, but does actually exist. And so it's a really fun story in a lot of ways. There's a lot of humor there. There is some really like there's some horror elements here as well. And so it feels very fantastical as a portal fantasy, but we get kind of some more scientific explanations for why things are the way that they are and how things came about in this way. And so as a result, I do think it toes the line of like fantasy and sci-fi and horror. It's kind of a blend of all three. I was really impressed with Tchaikovsky's writing style. I think that he is a fabulous writer, and the way that he would phrase things was so picturesque at times and so poignant at times. But I wanted a little bit more from the story than I ended up getting. I kind of saw where he was trying to go with things, but I felt a disconnect from the main character. He's someone who's relatively self-centered, and I guess that maybe that's kind of the part of the point of the story. And also it takes place during COVID, so there's this really interesting conversation surrounding isolation that's happening there as well, and feeling like you want your life to mean something. And so there were some really interesting things there, but there was another character who is more of a side character who did more than our main character did, and I kind of wished that the story had been more focused on her, because I just found her to be a more compelling and interesting character. However, it was a lot of fun and I really enjoyed it, so definitely will not be my last Tchaikovsky. The other 3 books that I read this month are all classics. So one of them I actually read for my Patreon book club, and that was The Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury. Maybe I could have put this in the last category, so And Put Childish Things Away wouldn't have been on its own, because this is a sci-fi, but it's also a classic. So this is a collection of interconnected short stories that Bradbury wrote about Earth essentially invading Mars and colonizing it, basically, because there were already Martians there. And so there's some interesting conversations that he is having in this book about many different things. There's not just really just one theme, although if I could say an overarching theme, there's definitely a theme of humanity thinking they know what's best and destroying things in the process. But there are, like I said, a lot of themes. He has, one short story in particular that he really delves deeply into religion and faith, and there are short stories where he delves really deeply into time or loss and grief. And so there's a lot of different things that he explores here. This was a near perfect book for me. I absolutely loved it. I was very compelled by it. There are, we start out with it being very much focused on the Martians, and then it kind of transitions to being much more focused on people of Earth. And so it was really interesting. There are some really great short stories in here. I had previously read There Will Come Soft Rains, which is like the second to last short story in this collection. And it was really interesting to read it in context of the book, because it was one that had been published separately in like a magazine or something, and actually quite a few of these were published separately initially, and then he decided to combine them and write some linking stories to kind of put them all together and help them make sense. But I had read that one before separately, and it kind of has this gut punch to it, because you don't know why things are happening the way that they're happening. It's following, a smart house, which it was written in the 50s. And so for him to be writing about a smart house long before that technology existed is eerie and interesting. But this smart house is functioning without people inside of it, and you don't know why. But if you read it in context of this book, finding out why, you already know why. And so it doesn't have that same punchiness, but it still is really poignant and deep, and a really interesting conversation about technology versus nature and how humanity fits into that puzzle. And so I found it to be still just as interesting the second time around, and it was still one of my favorite short stories in this collection. But there's a few others that I just wanted to talk about which ones I thought were some of my favorites. I really, really loved Usher 2, which is a love letter to Poe, really. It felt very campy and very fun, and a lot of callbacks to many different Poe short stories, but it also ties in with Fahrenheit 451, because it has to do with this man who has moved to Mars because Earth burned books, and so he wanted to go in a place where he was allowed to have that imaginative dependence on literature and love for that. And so it was just really fun. There's also some kind of more haunting ones like The Martian and The Long Years, and I would actually include There Will Come Soft Rains in that as well, in terms of it feeling kind of haunting, but really, really interesting, the things that he did there. And then there's a few of like men who are on expeditions to Mars that I found really interesting, particularly the Earthman and the Moon Be Still Is Bright. I found both of those to be really, really interesting. So those are some of my favorites. There's quite a few in here though, and I don't think that there are any that I actually like disliked. I really, really enjoyed this. This was one of my favorite books that I read this month, along with Wild Swans. I think that those were my two favorites. I also read Resurrection by Tolstoy, and I read this with Dina and Lauren, and that was such an enriching experience to read with both of them because we all kind of pulled different things out of this book. And so to combine all of that together is the beauty of buddy reading and being able to just gain so much more richness from conversations that you're having while you're reading a book. But this, I didn't know anything about this story going in because I just knew that it was Tolstoy, and I had had a few people tell me that this is their favorite Tolstoy. Unfortunately, I did not land in that camp. This is actually probably my least favorite Tolstoy that I have read so far. Not that I disliked it. It's still like a solid, probably 3.5, maybe 4 stars. And so I did enjoy my time with it. But essentially the crux of what is happening in this book is that there is a young woman who is being accused of murder, and we have a courtroom case at the beginning, which I found to be really compelling. There's a man who is on the jury who has previously known this woman, and so we're also getting the background story of how they knew each other, what their interactions were, and then as there is injustice in the various systems in Russia, this man wants to kind of right some of the wrongs and just feels really passionately about justice and seeing the corruption in all of these places and wants to enact some change because he comes from a wealthy family. So he is in a position where he's able to do that. The messaging of this book was really, really good, and I felt very ahead of its time, especially with Tolstoy's criticism of the legal system and the prison system at the time, but his criticisms are not limited to those things. He also criticizes the church and politics and wealth and basically the corruption in every aspect in Russia at the time. Where this book kind of went a little bit awry for me is that, first of all, I felt like we spent a lot of time hopping from place to place and examining corruption in different places, and our main character going from place to place to place and person to person to person, kind of almost on this like wild goose chase of trying to right some wrongs. And we just hop from place to place and person to person and never really come back to those people again. And so it just felt like a little bit repetitive and also not as emotional. The beginning of this book was incredibly interesting and emotional, and it drew me right in, and it felt like it was going to be very relational, and it felt like we were going to get a lot of this woman's story and a lot of this man's story, and it kind of more centers on him going on a quest to solve some things, kind of a thing. And it didn't have the same relational connection that I was hoping it would, that it did at the beginning. So as a result, I just didn't feel as connected to it as I did to, say, Anna Karenina or even War and Peace. And I've talked at length about how I did struggle with War and Peace, with some of the historical battle elements and the strategy, and how that kind of weighed the whole book down for me. But I felt incredibly emotional when I was reading War and Peace, and there were several moments that moved me to tears with how beautifully it was written and the depth of relationship and human emotion. And that just felt a little lacking in this book for me, which is unfortunate. I was really hoping it might be a favorite Tolstoy of mine also, but it just wasn't there. But it was still a good book and certainly worth reading, and I'm really glad that I did. And the last book that I'm going to talk about is the shortest book that I read this month, and that is The Stranger by Albert Camus. This is a translated French classic that I actually did a blog for over on my Patreon. So every month I choose a book that was recommended to me by one of my patrons and do a full spoilery vlog and talk about all my thoughts. And so this is the book that I ended up doing during the month of November because I needed something short, and this one was very short. The only thing that I knew about this book going in is that it was strange, and It sure is. So in this book, we follow a man who kind of gets himself into some sticky situations, partly because he just doesn't fit in society, the way that he views the world and the way that he processes emotion or lack thereof is very, very different than what is considered normal in society. As a result, he feels like and is treated as a stranger in society. And so it's interesting. I'm not going to say too much more about it because I don't want to spoil what happens halfway through the book. But I felt like the first half of the book, I was kind of like, what are we doing and why are we here? Because it's very detail oriented because it is a first person narration. And so our narrator is very detailed as he's talking about what's happening, but he's so emotionless that I felt really distant and not connected. And I'm like, why do we care about this? And then something happens halfway through the book, and I felt like the second half of the book feels a lot more cohesive and makes more sense because now I know why we're here. And so it definitely did pick up for me. I found it to be really, really fascinating and extremely philosophical. And I definitely do not agree with the philosophical leanings that the author had, but it was still really interesting food for thought, even if I fundamentally disagreed with pretty much everything he was saying. Well, those are all the books that I read in the month of November. I had plans to read other books that I ended up DNFing, unfortunately, but I feel like the books that I did finish were ones that I did enjoy and that I am really glad that I read. So even though I have less to talk about this month, I have probably much more positive feelings than I would if I had kind of forced myself to finish the books that I DNF'd. I'd love to hear from you in the comments down below. How was your reading month in November? I've found, tend to feel a tiny bit slumpy in the month of November, and I think it's because I'm coming off the high of October, and that seems to happen really frequently. I usually overschedule myself in October, and then I'm feeling a little burnt out when I'm reaching November. Plus, usually I've read some really fabulous Victorian books, and then I often feel that the books that I pick up in November don't quite measure up. So I did have a couple of books that I absolutely loved this month, though. So I'm curious to hear how was your reading in November? Did you feel a bit slumpy as well, or did you have a great reading month? I would love to hear what you have been reading. If you've read any of the books that I talked about here, I would love to chat with you about those in the comments, but I would especially love to know what was your favorite book that you read in the month of November. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please hit like and also subscribe so you can continue to see more bookish content from me, and I will see you again next time.